In this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the items that the author of Think Like an Architect discussed in Chapter 2. Halbach, who is the author, starts talking about experiencing architecture in a series of 10 steps. So we're going to discuss some of those, and we're going to talk about specific examples of architecture where you can apply those steps to them, and then potentially you can kind of learn this as an analytical or critical tool with architecture, and you could apply that to other buildings. We're going to have an assignment coming up where you're going to visit a building and you're going to kind of apply these skills or these steps that you've learned in order to analyze different works of architecture. So one of the things that we start looking at is architectural seeing. Like, what is it that you're actually seeing? Like, you can look at something and maybe you don't think too much about it, or you just kind of use it as part of your daily routine. But when we're talking about really thinking about meaning in architecture and looking more critically at a building, we want to really train our eyes to see what it is that we're looking at. And in the book, he talks a lot about it being exercise, or almost like an athlete practicing, or just somebody practicing some skill where you really have to train yourself to see in a different way in order to take all of the meaning and visual cues in to whatever architecture you happen to be looking at. The first thing he starts off talking about is dreaming and seeing. And, dreaming conjures up all kinds of images, but the idea that when you're younger, you pretend or play in a way that you're making up buildings that you might potentially like, or you have some kind of dream scenario of a place to live or a house or any building or fort that you might happen to make. We tend to lose that over time. And so we're kind of trying to get back to that idea that we're being more imaginative about buildings in our head. So not just looking at the buildings that we see, but also conjuring up ideas in our mind, or if we go to some building thinking, oh, well, how could I improve this? Or that's interesting, or, really starting to analyze and think about what's in our imagination in terms of architecture and also what's there in reality. So the first step that we look at when we're talking about analyzing buildings is this idea of social understanding. Now, social understanding, that doesn't mean socialization necessarily. We're kind of looking at it from a sociological standpoint. More like, okay, before we start looking at the physical aspects of the architecture, what is it that caused whomever to build this? Why did they need it? What was the purpose of this? And this can go for any type of architecture. It could be, for a public piece of architecture, or, somebody's shelter, or whatever it happens to be. You want to kind of back up and say, okay, what was going on at the time that this was built? What was going on with the people who built it or designed it? And, you can go through these series of questions that will help you kind of figure that out. So the first one is, why was it built? And sometimes we ask this of, historic works where we can't identify the culture, in our present day context, or we can't physically talk to people who built it. Sometimes we're trying to figure out, what were they doing? Why were they building this? Was this out of necessity? Was this out of some desire to have some communal space? Why were they building it? This can also be asked of, current works of architecture or modern works of architecture. Why was it built? What were the sociological factors that led to it being built? And the other thing you can say is what is or what was its function in the community? Did it serve a large group of people? Did it serve a particular need in the culture? And maybe it's not a need. Maybe it's a desire for that community to have some kind of space or building or gathering point. Perhaps its function is different now than it originally was. We're going to look at a few pieces of architecture where it was originally built as one particular use, and then over time either different people took it over or the needs of the community evolved to the point where it changed uses. And that happens quite a bit, and especially over time. We tend to build things for a particular purpose, and then, as different people leave or move in or whatever it happens to be, that function may change over time. So we can also look at specific examples of this. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that these particular works of architecture don't have other implications besides sociological ones. Obviously, they do, and we find them interesting in many different ways. But the first one that we're going to look at is Angkor Wat. And Angkor Wat is a temple and a religious shrine in Cambodia. And Angkor Wat is part of a series or complex of buildings, this Angkor complex, that was originally created as a Hindu shrine to the god Vishnu. And in this whole area, there are several different temples, and not just in the immediate vicinity of the Angkor complex, but several kilometers away in what were adjacent kind of neighboring towns. There are all these small archaeological and temple sites. So this is really the largest cluster of religious monuments in the world. And the architecture is fascinating, but also, kind of the symbology and the drive to build this. So originally it was created as a Hindu temple, and then over time it became a Buddhist kind of religious site. And so it's evolved over time, just depending on the people who originally built it. The Khmer Empire, the king in the Khmer Empire, ordered to have this constructed. And it took a while for it to be built. And so, it started off as, it was begun by a king named Suryavarman II. And then it translates roughly as Temple City. Angkor Wat translates as Temple City. And so it was this, city or kind of complex of various buildings. And you can see this is actually a very large-scale facility, and, complete with walled areas and walled gardens, almost like a series of fortresses. And, it wasn't until the past several decades where it's been open completely to tourism. And so the sandstone is not that most of the buildings are created with, wasn't meant to have, tons of people visiting it. And so you can see some of the deterioration of the site even just in the last several years. But the symbols of the architecture, you can see there are these kind of peaks. They almost look like giant pine cones. And but it was meant to symbolize a mountain, and it's a symbolic mountain. So it's as if you're going, kind of to the spiritual mountaintop. And that theme carries throughout the entire complex. So as we look at that, we can see some examples of some of the carvings and some of the symbols here, and these become really detailed, and you can see that it's extremely labor intensive, and because it's such a huge complex, there are many different shrines and symbols that are displayed throughout the entire park and kind of this entire province. So that idea of the temple, it's referred to as Mount Meru. It's kind of a symbolic sacred mountain in Hindu symbology and Hindu cosmology. So it was started by one Khmer Empire king, and then completed by Jayavarman VII. So this is kind of a sociological example where it was created as one thing, originally as a Hindu shrine, and became a Buddhist temple. This is a very different work of architecture. This is a private residence, so much smaller scale site, much smaller scale facility. And this is the house that Luis Barragan, the Mexican architect, designed for himself. And this is located in Mexico City. And it was built post-World War II, so it kind of takes some of the elements of modernism that were occurring around that time. A lot of modernists at the close of World War II were kind of rejecting all the old ornament and historical references that many architects had kind of carried through the early part of the 20th century. But Barragan really incorporated the culture of Mexico into his modernist views and modernist take on things. And so you see that played out in the color choices and the use of light and shade and shadow and these kind of big solids, and then places where there are voids in the walls. But the interesting thing is, and the reason why we look at this in terms of social understanding is, sometimes social understanding, we're not just talking about the people who were there or the people who created it. We're also talking about how the building relates to its surroundings, in terms of, socially, like, is it part of the fabric of the area? Is it part of the fabric of the urban context, or even if it's a rural context, like, how well does it make reference to that, or does it blend in at all? The interesting thing about this is that it really takes this idea of the traditional Mexican courtyard home, or courtyard facility, and it's a very internal type of experience. And so the light is coming in from different areas, like some places in the ceiling, some places as openings in the wall. There are very thick walls, very traditional use of materials, and choice of colors, but in a very streamlined, kind of pared down modernist way. But the interesting thing, if we look at the exterior of this project, you can see in the lower right corner, that is the entrance to this house. And it's very surprising once you know what the interior looks like, how dynamic the colors are, and the play of light and the shadows. It blends in completely with the exterior. You almost wouldn't know at all that this was his house. But it's really common, just kind of having that more protective private layer at the street, and then all of the life of the house really happens on the interior part of the compound. And it is kind of like a compound where even if it's small scale, because you have that interior courtyard, you enter in through an exterior wall or gate or something that doesn't really let on what's happening inside. And so it really, is almost invisible at the urban edge, at the street facade. The next thing we look at is, when you're talking about these steps to how to better experience architecture, or how to really analyze your experience with buildings, the second thing you can do is literally just look up. So the author talks about raising your normal view. In our daily lives, I think we tend to just kind of look straight ahead or look down at, where we're walking or whatever task we happen to be doing, and we don't tend to look up and see what's happening with buildings. Now, this is in Grand Central Station, and this has a fantastic ceiling scape almost. They're beautiful, restored paintings of constellations. There's, intricate detail and stonework, and it's one of the busiest rooms in the country also, where people just are running from one place to the next, and not a whole lot of people are looking up to see what's happening in the room. But you can learn a lot about a building just by looking up and noticing the structure, the light coming in, the windows, how it's, held up by whatever structure happens to be there, and any kind of ornament or decoration. But it also helps you to kind of stop and look at the building, where it's hard to look up and be running or walking at the same time. So it allows you to kind of take a breath, look up, and really stop and think about what's going on with the building. Now, one particular work of architecture where you can do this, and where people tend to do this, is it's called Hagia Sophia. And Hagia Sophia is a really important work of architecture. It's in Istanbul, Turkey, and it's probably the best example of Byzantine architecture from that period. And originally, at the time that it was built, Greece and Greek culture was heavily influencing this area. And so actually the architects are also Greek scientists and kind of mathematicians, and calculated this the shape of the dome and these side chapels. And it's been added onto and kind of evolved over time, and you'll see that it's taken on several different forms and formats, especially in terms of its religious symbols and its religious kind of placeholder. But the architecture itself is quite fascinating. So the interior has a lot going on. The exterior gives you a small hint of what you may find inside. It's got all these domed structures and several different side chapels and kind of side halls. But you can see so many different eras in this one building. So it was originally constructed as a Greek Orthodox cathedral, and you can still see some of the original paintings and symbols of the Greek Orthodox Church that are painted throughout this facility, and also just in the arches and the dome and the way the light comes in. And then at one point in the 13th century, it served as a Roman Catholic church. And so then you see symbols of the Roman Catholic Church as it affected it at that time. And then in roughly the 15th century, it became an Islamic mosque. And was a holy site for Islam for many years, or many centuries actually. And then in the 20th century, around the time of the kind of the beginning of the Second World War, it was commissioned as a museum and kind of a cultural heritage site in Turkey. So since about 1935, it's served as just a cultural museum, and visitors from all over the world come to see it because it's such a unique architectural example, and it still exists. So some examples of Byzantine architecture just are simply not around any longer, but you see all of the kind of decoration and symbols of its past and all its different iterations. So these two architects, Anthemius and Isidore, were Greek and heavily influenced by, mathematics and other things that were going on at the time in Greece. And again, it's a great example of Byzantine architecture. Istanbul used to be Constantinople, and so Constantine had had a lot of influence over what was going on at the time. Another place where it's great to kind of test your skills in looking up and checking out what's above you is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And the Guggenheim is set on a prime street. It's Fifth Avenue, across from Central Park. And when you're looking at this corner, it's hard to tell that there are not buildings on the other side. The park is where the photographer is standing. But when you look at this kind of urban fabric, the roundness of the museum really starts to break up all of the angular buildings that are running along the street, not only on Fifth Avenue, but on all the side streets. But because the park is across the street, you do start to get a glimpse of this as you're either walking or coming down that street from either direction. So you get a hint of what's going to be happening inside from the outside, but when you come into the central kind of front door lobby, you're immediately kind of encouraged to look up because of the central skylight up at the top. So this is a view looking up. And there's a circular ramp that runs all around the perimeter of that main gallery space. And so the experience is one of experiencing the art on the ramp. So the ramp becomes the gallery. And Frank Lloyd Wright was the architect of the Guggenheim, and originally he had the idea that instead of kind of trudging up the ramp continuously, that you would take the elevator up to the top and then work your way down so that it was always kind of a downhill, easy, leisurely stroll, and it was kind of a nice physical experience as you're coming down and experiencing the art. And the ramp is not steep when you're there, so you don't realize that you're kind of on a slope the entire time. But the central skylight was closed off for many years. It was built in the 50s, and so it wasn't restored again until the early 90s when they did an addition to the museum, and they restored the skylight as Wright intended it to be. And so now you get a lot of the original intent in terms of the natural light coming in, and the art is still tucked under most of these ramping surfaces where it's like at the exterior wall, but as you're walking through, you're able to experience the ambient sunlight from the skylight coming in. You see another view of this skylight looking up and all of the ramps coming around. And at the time, Wright was really exploring the idea of natural forms and was inspired by a nautilus shell. And now that might not seem as uncommon as it was then, but this is really kind of bucking a lot of the modernist trends of being very angular and rectilinear. So it was completed in 1959 and was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's kind of last major works of architecture. One of the main things that is talked about in the book is going and physically experiencing architecture. So this idea of sensing the space, ironically, I'm showing you a bunch of photos, but the best way to experience architecture is to actually go visit it and stand in it and feel what it's like to be in that space. So he also talks a bit about architecture being a visual experience almost more than anything. It's an entirely sensory experience, but he was saying, okay, it's about 80% visual, where you're trying to take in all of that visual information by looking around, looking up, seeing the details, seeing what the entire space is like. But then also hearing people as they move throughout that space, checking to see if it's quiet, if it's loud, what the materials sound like, and also what it feels like to walk through that space or sit down in that space or just be there and feel what it's like to be in that space. So it's an all-around sensory experience. The other thing is that when you're trying to kind of take in a building, you're continuing to train yourself. You're training your mind, you're training your eyes, and how you sense what the space is like. And as you go to more buildings, you just get better at experiencing that. And especially for architects and designers, there's no better teacher than going to other buildings and feeling what that space feels like. Like, oh, if I make something this big, if I design something this big, this is what it feels like. If I design something this width or this height or with these materials, here's what it actually feels like. Because you can draw it all you want, but experiencing it firsthand is the real teacher. The other thing in the book is this idea that you can't really hold architecture in your hand. It's not like an object or a commodity. You have to go physically put yourself in that building or in that space so that you know what it's like. One good example of this is going to the Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon is probably the most well-preserved ancient piece of Roman architecture, and it's also one of the earliest examples that we have of a cast-in-place concrete building, and the experience is really just incredible between the materials and the size of it and the proportions, and seeing it from the exterior and then going into the main space or the main room is really a pretty incredible experience. So when you go into the Pantheon, the thing that strikes you is not only its materials, and it's got this coffered concrete ceiling, but this huge oculus or this opening in the middle. So it's about I think between about 25 and 30 feet across in diameter, and it's just open, and so it allows light in, allows air in, allows heat to escape. Rain comes in. The floor is even sloped to kind of accommodate some rain that comes in and kind of drain away a little bit. But just the experience of standing there and then hearing what it's like to have other people talking in the room and walking around in the room, and the play of light. You can even see in this photo, the light just comes in and travels throughout the room all day long because you've got this shaft of light that's coming through a set hole in the ceiling, or kind of this dome, and then it just moves throughout the space all day long. Sometimes it hits the floor, sometimes it hits a wall, but you really get a sense of what it's like to be in that space. And this was commissioned by the Emperor Hadrian. There was another building on that site previously that had been built by the Emperor Augustus, and it was completed in 128 AD. So to think that the kind of shape it's in now for being built in 128 AD is quite remarkable. It's also dedicated as a church. It was dedicated several centuries ago, and so you see this inscription on the outside to Saint Mary and the Martyrs, because that's who the church is dedicated to. Rheims Cathedral is one that the author talks about going for the first time and seeing Rheims Cathedral. And one thing that's kind of helpful, I think, that he talks about in the book is, especially if you're not really in the habit of looking at architecture and kind of training your eyes and training your mind to see certain things, is before you go to something that you know is going to be a major, piece of architecture or a monument or something that you've been looking forward to, is to really study it out and study it out visually. Look at drawings of it, become familiar with its layout, become familiar with photographs of it, and kind of prep yourself for what you're going to experience when you're in that space, so that when you're there, you can really appreciate it, and then, get a lot more out of it, and you can get some intellectual feedback in your mind, but also feel how the space is. And one of the things that is striking about, especially the approach to this cathedral, not unlike many Gothic cathedrals, this is built in the French Gothic style, is just how massive everything is. And so the intent there is to make you as a person feel quite small, and you really do. I mean, you can see how a person stacks up just to the doors at the front of this cathedral. And so, you get a sense on the outside of what it's going to be like on the inside because of its size and its decoration and the stained glass and everything that accompanies that. And then when you go in, because of its, central hall and the central nave and the aisles at the side, and it uses this, the very Gothic kind of symbols and elements, such as the rose window, that stained glass rose window, the buttressing, the vaults in the ceiling and the structure that allow for more glass to come in at the side, and you really get this experience of the light filtering in and both literally and figuratively making you feel quite small as a person. And that's the idea, is that you feel less significant in comparison to this building, and also because it's a church and meant to be kind of a spiritual yet humbling experience. So the architects are not known on this project. It seems that there were several architects that worked on this. Typically, of this period, the architects would likely be known, but it's not really attributed to one or two individuals. So it seems that several people worked on this, but there's some good details of the carvings at this cathedral. There are many on the outside and many on the inside that are unique to this particular cathedral. It was the site of many coronations of French kings, so it's not only is it architecturally significant, but it's significant in the history of France.